Welcome back, fellow tubers. It's been a long, bizarre year, with one crazy occurrence after the other, stretching to the point that this year feels bigger on the inside, so to speak. Which makes me feel all the more guilty for not being able to put together a proper countdown for top 10 games I played in 2019. But 2020 is finally over, and I'd like to start 2021 off by contemplating the games that helped me maintain a sense of normalcy throughout this year. Considering how much was announced to come out in 2020 at last year's E3, I expected a bigger year. But most of what I was excited for got delayed, and what actually did come out this year didn't interest me. So, for the most part, this is just another fight with my old nemesis, the backlog. Here's the top 10 games I played in 2020. My extensive backlog has made me very numb to the hype surrounding games being currently released. Sure, I'm as excited as anyone to see them get announced, but while my friends are playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, I'm playing Final Fantasy VI SNES, and I end up tuning out excited discussions to avoid spoilers. Still, every year, there are a handful of games that I end up playing outside of my official backlog run. This year's example, Super Mario 35. On the one hand, it's just Super Mario Bros. Again. On the other hand, it's so much more engaging when the objective isn't simply to make it to the end. Between the bonus time adding value to all the items, offensive value of sending defeated enemies to opponents, and the levels shuffling at random, I'm seeing levels of this game I've never seen, seeking out enemies for strategies that aren't usually worth my time, and completely relearning routes through the level. Even though as a battle royale, the rewards are mostly intrinsic, the fact that I can almost consistently hit number 1 makes me think I'd keep playing this even if it didn't have an expiration date. Last year, one of my old favorite games, that I never finished, finally came to the Switch with extra content. So, I really had no excuse to put off the main campaign any longer. Now that I've gotten through the whole thing, Puzzle Quest hasn't aged as well as I hoped it might, but there's still quite a bit here to love. It has one of the largest rosters of races I've seen in a fantasy setting, with otherwise normal talking animals, minotaurs, dragons, more than one kind of zombie, and a clear cultural distinction made between ogres, orcs, goblins, trolls, and giants. There's loads of side quests, many of which can be roleplayed different ways, earning different mechanical and narrative rewards. It's ridiculously impressive how far they push the match 3 mechanics for different scenarios, whether it be a normal battle, training a mount, crafting items, or learning new spells. They all have different rules and mechanics. Finally, the puzzle mechanics allow for some novel strategies for the combat, and of course, few games can top all the fun I've had in versus mode playing against my mom. Overall, it's a great comfort game, and I can't wait till I have time enough to play the spiritual sequel by the same company, Gems of War.
That was a heroic effort!
Considering how my interest in the Yoshi games has diminished over the years, I was not expecting to be super invested in Yoshi's Woolly World. And while it certainly doesn't deliver the same exact experiences that made the first Yoshi's Island a staple of my childhood, the complete package was easily the most pleasant surprise of enjoyable gaming I had all year. Every level manages to find an identity, even within the context of modern Mario's repetitive world types, and I especially liked the Desert Pyramid, Fluff and Puff Babysitting, Feel Fuzzy Get Clingy, and Hang Tongue, the secret level which executed an amazing premise flawlessly, to the point that it didn't scare me away from completion the way Poochie Ain't Stupid did as a kid. I did really miss having a new, crazy, giant version of a regular enemy every boss fight, but the bosses are still really satisfying to fight using Yoshi's unique combination of moves. Most importantly, that yarn aesthetic recreating Mario's biomes with knitwear is just so enthralling and cozy. I found myself super giddy every time I grabbed all the yarn rolls to complete a new costume. And it left me excited to revisit this again with my mom.
That
Having already covered Shovel Knight in one of these entries, some might consider it cheating to re-enter it in a later year like this. But Spectre Knight and King Knight are two vastly different campaigns to Shovel Knight and Plague Knight. Plus, King Knight came out this year, so I can say I played something from this year. Both campaigns have some great backstory content, with Spectre Knight recruiting the Order of No Quarter, and King Knight's characterizes him as a lives in his mother's basement slacker with delusions of grandeur, which was hilarious. I didn't really dig how picky Spectre Knight's signature running and sliding mechanics were, but having a greater access to all the missions from the beginning makes it great to revisit. King Knight, on the other hand, is a glorious bruiser turned acrobat style platforming that nearly reaches Plague Knight levels of fun, and is probably my favorite character for boss fight. It's super satisfying to mid-air dash into an enemy for an extra jump that also turns King Knight into a hop and bop style platformer for extra damage on whatever's in your way. Then, there's the deceptively simple card game, which is just the cherry on top, with easy to learn, hard to master mechanics, and surprisingly diverse boards to ensure the minigame was a fully realized addition. Now that I've played the full package, I'm pretty sure the Treasure Trove is one of the best platformers I've ever played, even if it's not my personal favorite. One game that sucked up a surprising amount of my time this year for how fun it was and how compatible it was with playing while stuff is going on in the background was Dicey Dungeons, which I like to describe as D&D meets Yahtzee, even if it doesn't really have heavy narrative role-playing. The Wheel of Fortune meets a magical circus vibe exists as more of a backdrop than a dynamically evolving narrative, but it does have an amazing build-up and payoff. This is also the first roguelike where I actually feel it's mostly my fault when I lose a run, for not taking full advantage of every tool available to me, as opposed to simply being blown about by the winds of RNG. I especially appreciate how, despite being held to just d6 dice, the personality, abilities, and aesthetic of the characters comes through in all the quirks affecting how many dice you have and what you can do with them. It also has hands down the best use of status effects in any RPG I can think of, all having annoying and debilitating consequences that are clearly conveyed and can be used to your advantage if you know what you're doing, or cripple you in a single turn if you don't. The poison effect in particular is the sort of thing I want in every turn-based game from now on and forever. While there are certainly games on here that have more loops which strongly resonate with me, this is the game that gets the highest recommendation for a general audience. Before he made Garfield, Jim Davis had a comic strip with a group of insects as its main cast. He retired it because a newspaper distributor informed him that as good as his comedy was, no one can relate to bugs. That's a fair constructive criticism, because even in an era where Pixar has taught us that everything has feelings, especially bugs, it takes a particular art style and narrative direction to show bugs in their best light. Hollow Knight is one of the many recent games that lets insanely intricate and pretty atmosphere do the talking instead of forcing the player to engage in a linear series of scripted scenarios. It's also just a really great 2D Metroidvania with some sick mobility options and dynamic combat ability, like double jumps, dashes, wall jumping, bouncing off of parried enemies for pseudo jumps, and whatever is even happening here. The combat also has an inventive dynamic where you heal and perform ranged attacks off the same energy pool, which is collected mid-fight by getting in there and hitting the enemy, which ensures fights are full of nerve-wracking split-second decisions between attacking and trying to heal before you get smacked. All this while using bugs to convey nobility, cowardice, dedication, terrifying monstrosity, pure cuteness, and how we all feel about 2020 about now.
Bajanada.
Better than even the later entries on this list, which use humans. The only minor disappointment I have with the game is that there aren't a lot of combat styles that jive with me personally. But even so, Hollow Nest is one of those hauntingly beautiful places worth exploring just to see what's lurking in the shadows. Oh yeah, this one has been a long time coming. The mercantile process is a type of engagement I'm especially fond of that multiple titles have tacked on to their games, but none have come closer to delivering the complete package than Recettear, an item shop tale, which is a cute anime RPG where you run the item shop. And while dungeon exploration is a thing, the primary gameplay is in purchasing every item as cheaply as possible and selling it for as much as the customer is willing to spend, all to pay off a debt in a certain amount of time. This led to one of the big memorable moments in gaming of the year for me. The mad rush to scrounge together 500,000 picks over the course of the final 2 weeks. Even having a large solid grasp of the mechanics and having saved up to expand the shop after the semi-final week's payment, I still had to spend the majority of that time pushing my haggling and time management skills to the limit in order to reach the goal. All to be rewarded with a hilarious bit at the end of the credits where certain characters explain all the game modes available after a first run, making it one of those games that screams to be revisited sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, the dungeon crawling combat is really unrefined, and while it's the kind of simple fun that goes well with a podcast, it makes reaching some of the extra content a slog. Otherwise, I would have put this closer to number 1. Either way, it's an adorable indie title from Japan with fantastic localization that will always get at least an honorable mention from me. Capitalism Ho! Castlevania Symphony of the Night is more or less the game that got me into Metroidvanias. It checks off so many of my gameplay boxes and has an aesthetic that toes the line between bleak horror and colorful epic fantasy. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is that, plus some great ideas from later games that expound on the collectathon and RPG elements. It already feels really satisfying to disintegrate the demons swarming whatever structure you're exploring for a given game. But between the ingredients for food that offers permanent stat buffs, the materials to craft all kinds of equipment, and many colorful shards that pop out of enemies to give you new spells or enhance the ones you already have, there's plenty of incentive to exterminate every last baddie you meet. From blasts to bolts to waves to shields and the world turned upside down technique, there's a spell for every occasion. Meanwhile, the weapon skills offer a stylish, more cost-effective alternative, even if I personally cannot pull off those weapon inputs to save my life. Then there are the bosses, which are either built around really cool set pieces, or properly test your mastery of your own abilities by pitting you against enemies with comparable attacks, hitboxes, and mobility. I can't say the setting and plot are terribly original or even all that interesting on their own merits, but the individual characters themselves were likable from the get-go. Miriam and Johannes are a formidable team, and remarkably optimistic despite the trials they've gone through. And between the stuff we actually see and the stuff he's implied to do, Zangetsu stands up there with the best demon hunters in fantasy. Finally, the secret solution for getting the good end is incredibly satisfying to pull off, even if it's still pretty darn cryptic.
Fascinating. People do their hair like this?
Hey look, we're continuing the tradition of playing a game the same year its sequel came out. Isn't that just pathetic? Seriously though, Spider-Man PS4 is great. I love having a grown-up Peter Parker who actively works with the police to take down a local crime boss in the first mission of the game. And I so very much appreciate the notion that Peter is, in fact, one of the geniuses of the Marvel Universe and can do as much good for the world as a civilian scientist as he can running around mixing it up with the street criminals. Having never played any of the older Spider-Man games, I wasn't sure how much I would enjoy the web-swinging acrobatics or other gameplay features, but the fan service definitely doesn't end at the plot. The dizzying array of acrobatic techniques involving the web ropes to propel yourself around the city is distinctly Spider-Man, intuitive to use, and no matter how much my instincts want me to settle into a specific one as my default, I can't, because each one is satisfying to pull off and has its own important niche to fill in traversing the varied terrain of New York. As a casual fan of Spider-Man, it's really great to see all these unique costumes for the first time, especially with all the obscure combinations of powers they bring into play. And, as per usual, the Collectathon fan in me is all about the different collectibles used to make and upgrade those costumes. Whether it's filling us in on the backstory for this version of Peter through his backpacks from high school, rescuing civilians, or Peter working with Doc Ock of all people to research new materials, there's a little something for every gameplay type. Lastly, having spent far too much time lately trying to wrap my head around the positive and negative aspects of action gameplay appeal, I greatly appreciate the moderately low skill floor and the ridiculously high ceiling for tricks and strategies that can be employed with this combat system, which combines stealth, melee, aerial, and ranged attacks into a stylish flurry of motion that I'm still coming to grips with. It would probably be my number one if I'd managed to finish it before the end of the year, but having not, I can't definitively rule that.
Did that just happen? Yeah.
So what beats Bloodstained, Hollow Knight, and Spider-Man? Well, one mechanic and world-building idea I've been wanting to see in an RPG for a while now is characters with different professions and combat backgrounds that play differently in very noticeable ways. Octopath Traveler doesn't quite deliver on everything I was envisioning, but it's a darn good RPG. For better or worse, the game builds everything narrative and mechanical around 7 competent characters and Therion. Not only are everyone in this group, including 2 Avengers, a priestess, a scholar, a beastmaster, an apothecary, a merchant, and a thief who gets caught at the end of every chapter, characters that could carry whole games on their own, but I love how their stories are mostly separate from each other. Yes, there's a missed opportunity to have them grow and interact together over the course of a single story, but the arcs they go through are satisfying, and it's just refreshing to me to have an RPG not directly correlate the challenges the main cast face with a big bad. The world feels more real and alive when mundane and personal conflicts are treated as such instead of pretending everything wrong with the world goes back to a singular evil being. Speaking of the world feeling alive, there's a delightful system that makes NPC interactions extra engaging by giving the party the ability to get some information from the NPC, buy or steal some items from them, fight them to progress past the spot they're blocking, or even get them to temporarily join the party. Leading from there into combat, the boost and weakness break systems are turn-based combat gold. From start to finish, every turn of every battle is a risk-reward assessment between maintaining the party's health, stockpiling buffs, stun-locking the enemy, and hitting as hard as you can in a single turn. On top of that, there's all kinds of secondary goals like, do I want to catch this Pokemon? Do I really have the patience for Tressa and Therion to whittle down this punk's health to steal his watch or wallet? And, do I want to roll a dice on dancing with the risk of getting debuffed for a small chance of extra XP? Octopath is by no means perfect. And unlike past years, this number 1 slot is not a strong contender for my top 10 games of all time. But of the games I played in 2020, it's my favorite.
Thank you!
So that was my 2020 in a nutshell. Feel free to share what you had fun playing during the year, and inform me how much I missed out by ignoring 2020's not-so-greatest hits down in the comments. Plus, stay tuned. I have been working on my next countdown the whole time, and fingers crossed, it should be up in a few weeks. For now, the century is old enough to drink, and I'm prepared for some crazy times. See you all next time.